Welcome to Econ Thoughts, the podcast of the Society of Professional Economists in the UK from London. And our guest today is Gauti Eggertsson, and he's a professor of economics at Brown University and also an expert in monetary and fiscal policy. And we'll cover quite a lot of that in our show today. Gauti, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Good. So before we kind of start talking about inflation, the business cycles, what happened with the Fed over the last kind of few years, it might be good for our listener, Gauti, for you to explain a little bit about what do you do at Brown, and also a little bit of your background in terms of how did you get there, and how did you get to do what you do today?
Well, I'm actually originally from Iceland, and I hope English or British listening don't hold it against me that we won the Cod War against you in the 70s. You may not know about it, but I learned about it growing up. I go from Iceland as an undergraduate and do a PhD in Princeton. And it was a very special time there because there was sort of a collection of people that had a big impact on me. And there was a lot of discussion at the time about things related to Japan at the time. This is in the late 90s, early 2000s. So my committee was composed of Paul Krugman, Ben Bernanke, Chris Sims, and Mike Woodford. So three of whom I say that at Granger cost their Nobel Prize. It was a good predictor. Three of them got Nobel Prize, and one was a chairman. So I asked my main advisor, I remember at some point, so what are you up to? That's Mike Woodford. You'll probably get it eventually too. So I was tremendously lucky in that coming for the first time to America from Iceland and being thrown into that exciting intellectual environment was amazing. So I start my research largely focusing on policy at low interest rates. And in the following years, I would be bumming around at various universities. I was also at I was at the IMF for a little bit and at the New York Fed. Mm-hmm. And then I taught at as visiting professor at various places like Yale and Princeton and Columbia. And then ultimately I took a position up here in Brown, where my wife's family is actually from, which is in Providence, just south of Boston.
Okay, very good, very good. Thank you for the introduction. I mean, obviously I've been kind of in company of three Nobel Prize winners. It's pretty impressive.
They didn't have it then. That was
yeah.
No, none of them had, and Ben Bernanke, nothing could be further from my mind that bearded academic would wind up being the Fed chairman. I think that the same would hold true for him. I remember the faculty at Princeton when he was appointed by a Republican said, "Wait, wasn't he a Democrat? Isn't he a Democrat?" so it was quite unexpected, all of it.
It's definitely a great experience, and also having worked obviously in the Fed, and we'll talk a little bit about the Fed performance in a second. So more recently, you also kind of been writing around kind of monetary policy, inflation, and we'll talk a little bit about a couple of the papers that you wrote recently. One in particular was that you presented at Jackson Hole last summer. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your kind of views and thoughts around the inflation surge of the early 2020, so a few years back, and also where we are now in terms of that particular kind of cycle. Are we can the Fed actually say that it's mission accomplished and they managed to achieve the soft landing that they were aiming for, or are we still not out of the woods yet? Maybe we start first with what caused the inflation surge? How was it handled? And are we out of the woods yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to observe about the surge is how utterly unexpected it was for most economists. And I think it's easy to forget that now. If you look at like what people were forecasting, both at the Fed and survey of professional forecasters, they were consistently, it went up, and they were persistently expecting it to go straight down to target. And this was just due to, unexpected, not temporary supply shock. There's big debate between temporary versus permanent, although there's an ideological fight about what the temporary means. But to me, it always meant, should you have raised rates in the fall of I guess it was then in the fall of 21, and on the basis of whether you thought that these were transitory shocks or not. And I actually thought that you should not raise rates, because I thought these shocks were temporary, and this was just a temporary surge in inflation. And then I realized in sort of the fall of 21 that, well, I was wrong. I mean, it was clearly something going on much beyond just temporary shocks. So then, as we realized, I think most came to acknowledge that this was not a temporary thing. I guess the big question became, could you bring inflation down without a major recession? And here too, I think it's worth reminding listeners that there was a good number of people that were saying that it would be virtually impossible to bring inflation down without causing a major recession. I'm happy to have been on the right side of that bet, because I thought that you could do it, that you could bring it down, and that relates to this work that you have. So people were saying, looking at the labor market, that you would need to see an increase in unemployment to bring down inflation. But what turned out to happen was that the labor market stabilized, not by increasing unemployment, but by drop in the vacancies posted by firms. And that's sort of one of the themes that I have pursued in my work with Pierre Paolo, and I was talking about in Jackson Hole this summer. So if you want me to summarize sort of how we rationalize all of this, I'm happy to do that now, or if you want to.
Yeah, that'll be good, because it kind of follows on the discussion of how do you bring inflation down without a recession, which, as you said, is not typically what we'll expect. When you think about inflation, a lot of people, when you're up to 8-9%, you need to go back to the early 80s. Okay, it was probably even higher at the time. But then the inflation was kind of defeated, if you want to use that word, primarily through essentially a deep recession in 1982. So that's the memory that everybody had, and so they were expecting to be something similar in 2023, but it didn't happen.
I think the key mistake people make using that mode of thinking is that what distinguished the inflation surge in the US, at least relative to that time period, was that inflation expectations in the US, especially long term, they did not move. The Fed had a credibility, while the problem Volcker, who was the Fed chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, he was raising rate to try to bring down inflation, while inflation expectations were extremely high.
Yeah.
Okay, and one way of sort of thinking about this in the broader context, and we're always like fighting the last war. So the last big inflation that we have seen, or inflation surge, is the 1970s, which I think was, and then it's brought down in the 80s. That is largely brought about due to their supply shock, but then inflation expectations start moving all around. Now, think about U.S. economic history in the last 125 years. There are basically 6 major inflation surges, okay? And what do they have in common? They all have in common that the labor market is extraordinarily tight. So, and the measure that we have learned is, best way of thinking about it is not just unemployment, but instead, the ratio of vacancies, how many people firms are looking for, that's the demand side, relative to how many people are looking for a job, unemployment. So if you take a look at that measure, since we have it till 1919, it is above 1, so there are more firms looking for workers than workers looking for jobs. It's above 1 in basically 5 cases. In all of these 5 cases, you see an inflation surge. So this is like World War I, World War II. This is the Korean War. Then the late 60s, when you have Johnson tax cuts together with Vietnam spending, and then the latest episode. The 1970s is actually the only inflation surge that happened without this, measure of labor market becoming very tight. So, so that I think people are looking at a historical analog that was maybe not quite appropriate, unfortunately. So that's sort of one thing to keep in mind. But more generally, if you want to think about why we got it so wrong and what went wrong in the sort of model or frame of thinking we're using, and I include myself in that group, is that we had been estimating our models basically based upon sample where you didn't have this tightening in the labor market. We've basically been using typically data going back to the 70s and to 2019. And what that data was telling us, and was ingrained by the Fed, was that movements in our whatever measure you want to have of slack or unemployment was having trivial effect on inflation. And even supply shocks too, if you looked at core inflation. That's why the Fed always emphasized core inflation, that, even if you have oil price shock, core inflation was not moving a whole lot. So what we did in this paper was to say, well, actually, if you look further back, when you cross this, we call it the Beveridge threshold, in the honor of the British economist in 1941, suggested that this indicated an imbalance or excess tightness in the market if there were more firms looking for workers than workers for jobs. So what we suggest in this paper, looking at longer data set, is that once you cross this threshold and the market becomes excessively tight, the labor market becomes excessively tight, the Phillips curve, or the relationship between, tightness and inflation, changes. The slope of the Phillips curve, if you want, becomes steeper. So now every movement in, in the labor market starts having a bigger effect on inflation, and any supply shock also becomes supercharged. So, the estimates that people were making, not going past, 1970s, couldn't pick it up because, you never cross that threshold. But when you take a broader sample, then you see evidence of this, what we of course call inverse L, sort of like L put backwards, as of representing the Phillips curve. So it was sort of flat before, but at a certain point it becomes, you can kind of think about it this way. This actually goes back to the Keynesians before the Phillips curve. They imagined the world literally like an L that you turn backwards. So prices are fixed when you're below capacity. Capacity is sort of like a wall. So, when you're below capacity, you have empty firms and unemployed workers, you increase demand and you can just start, producing more. Well, at some point, though, you're going to run out of workers and you're fully utilizing all the production capacity. And then it's just like you hit a wall and prices become completely flexible, and you have sort of a classical world where, inflation is moving a lot.
And when was that threshold, the Beveridge threshold, passed? Is it pre-COVID or it was due to COVID?
It is passed essentially. No, so okay, so it gets passed right after the Biden stimulus.
So is it caused by the Biden stimulus? Then could you say that without?
I think it's a remarkable coincidence.
Yeah.
But we don't really. We are mostly it could be other factors.
Yeah.
The crossing probably has something to do with that. Does that mean that that the surge was entirely explained by that? No, because our theory also suggests that once you cross this threshold, supply shock starts having a much bigger impact.
Yeah.
Right? So we account like a third of the surge by supply shock and 2/3 to labor market.
The stimulus demand, yeah.
But I do think, if I'm just to be honest, I do think that the Biden stimulus played a big role in it, and that if you just looked at historical time series of disposable income by household, you see nothing like the stimulus checks in the U.S.
Yeah, because I think in a sense, on some of the other kind of guests that I had on the podcast here, even if they come from various different kind of perspective in terms of their potentially macroeconomic outlook that they have, most of them will probably say that the second stimulus, which is the Biden stimulus, was probably kind of on the excessive side or being too large to a certain extent, and probably kind of unwarranted at the time, because essentially we're all past kind of essentially the crisis, and in a sense he, as you said, he had at least kind of half of, if not more, kind of the impact in terms of why actually had the inflation at that level.
Yeah, and there's another element there, and this relates to why the Fed didn't react too much, and it relates to this measure of labor market that I was talking to, that you want to talk, and this dates back to like the British economist Beveridge, that you want to think not only about the number of unemployed, you also want to think about what the firms are trying to get, right, trying to hire. And the Fed, unemployment was actually above, pre-COVID levels. It was around 6. So if you were just looking at the unemployment rate, or you're just looking at, the number of people employed relative to those that could work, you might have thought that the labor market was still slack. It was only when you took into account that firms were basically unable to hire anybody that you realized. I mean, here in the U.S., I would go into a restaurant in Providence, and where I live, with my family of 5. We'd go into a restaurant, it would be 1/3 full. And they say, could we sit down for dinner? And the maitre d' would say, no, we're full. Like, what are you talking about? This Ruston is hardly populated. And then she would respond, oh, it's labor shortage.
Yeah.
So you saw that all across America, that even stores started closing during certain hours, and then they would just quote due to labor shortage. Some like temporary closed, and even more disturbingly, not disturbingly, but well, I come to the disturbing part in a second. Places like McDonald's started offering signing bonuses. Like I don't remember. I think that was like in Maryland or somewhere. The disturbing part is that other parts of McDonald's, instead of offering signing bonus, they offer their employees just to eat as much as they want.
Which is probably not what you would want to do with your bonus if you had.
Yeah, so that's that was the bonuses were fine, but so I think there were, despite the fact that unemployment was on the high side, I think the labor market was just extremely tight, and you just had to look out of the window here in the U.S. to realize, or walk down the street to realize. And I think it's something that the Fed missed in the beginning, but they eventually caught up.
Yeah. So then the Fed obviously increases rates and it manages expectation. The question is, you're right, actually, expectation didn't move, but I wonder if the Fed had not increased the rates, whether they could have started moving. In a sense, they didn't move because it was an expectation at some point they will react, and they did, and therefore potentially kept those expectations anchored. But if they hadn't acted, probably they could have started increasing.
I think they were really, if they would have held off much longer, I think it would have been a challenge, I think, I mean, I think there is this period, I think it becomes relatively obvious in like the fall of 21, late into the fall of 21, you really, you could explain, I don't remember, people may or may not remember well this period during the summer of 21 when the Fed and the White House were explaining every high reading of inflation. Oh, used cars are surging so much, or this or that. But, by late fall, no matter how you turned it, everything, there was just a general inflation. And there is really they don't start raising rate until March 22. And so I think there's a 6-month period there that is where they could have probably shaved off, prevented some of the, but, at the same time, long-term expectations were relatively stable. And then, they did bring down inflation without a major increase in unemployment. And again, I think the reason and why you could do that relative to the 70s is that because inflation expectations were stable, and if you believe, as we do, that you have sort of an inverse L relationship for the Phillips curve, so it's very flat until you reach this point when it becomes very steep. So steep, you could put on the x-axis some measure of economic activity or the overview or even just unemployment, means that you need very little increase in unemployment or very little, reduction in the output gap VOU to generate a big fall in inflation. And it's all going to come through just reduction in the, vacancies the firms are posting, which is obviously soft.
Yeah, and are we back now past that Beverly threshold, or are we still there? My point is, what is happening now? Are we at danger of a resurge on inflation, or is it kind of now tamed? Are we back into the more normal, traditional kind of flatter Phillips curve?
I mean, I think it is extremely so we are really right around that threshold level, which we don't really, I mean, Barry said 1, but we don't have really enough data to be able to pinpoint exactly what the threshold is. If you buy into my hypothesis, which you most certainly should, so we don't know the exact number, right? But I would say that I would be very optimistic, except with the presidential election, I just don't know, because I'm from Iceland. I really just don't understand the political dynamics we've seen. I have all sorts of hypotheses about it, but I find it very difficult to predict what Trump is actually going to do. So here's a couple of things. They talked prior to the election, and I don't know how serious they're about it, that they were going to take 12 million illegal immigrants and jet them out to wherever. Now, if you take 12 million, a lot of whom are working in these low-skilled jobs, the labor shortage was the biggest, and ship them out, well, then you're going to have very tight labor market. So that's number one. Number two, they have been talking about putting as high as 100% tariffs on China and even on Europe, some tariffs. If they are serious about that, and I have really no idea, that is also going to be inflationary. Okay, so then you're left with the Fed to react, which would they would have to start raising rates. And then you have another unknown, which is, how is Trump going to react to that?
Yeah.
He has been emboldened now by the Supreme Court of, sort of taking a pretty broad view of his executive powers. And, I don't know if you remember, but I do because I follow Fed pretty closely. He kept asking about if he could fire the Fed chairman. And so, and he seemed to be a bit like Erdogan in Turkey was, well, I think he may have with the massive increase in inflation there. He started believing that the way to reduce inflation was to cut rates, right? So, Trump always seems to want to see lower rates. So if you start exerting that power after having triggered inflation by tariffs, and exported 12 million people, then we have a pretty volatile mix.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's sort of like one dark scenario. I mean, another brighter scenario is that, well, he was just playing to the crowd. He didn't really mean that. There's going to be very performative gestures with respect to, you know, throwing out illegal immigrants, mostly going to just focus on criminals and such. With the tariff question, I think that's a tougher one. I think you have to really fix it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very all kind of interesting, very interesting, valid point. I think I would probably, from an inflationary point of view, be more worried about the labor market tightness and the immigration. That's probably, as you said, it will probably push you up that curve rapidly, and then it'll increase. I think the tariff is an interesting because you could say that if you apply a tariff across the board, you'll have a kind of impact. If it's selective to China, for example, it will to certain sectors. Obviously, you might have an increase in price in certain sectors, but not necessarily across the board. So you might actually have price level changing in certain areas, but not necessarily across the board. So the final inflationary impact might be slightly more reduced. So I'm probably less sanguine on the tariff, but I'm more on the labor market. Even though, as you said, potentially the labor market might be the ones where it's more difficult actually to take action because there is a lot more complicated than potentially there is in the tariff. So I think he's inflationary, but I'm not sure he's necessarily a shock that you will see in the first couple of months and suddenly inflation will go up. The other point on the Fed is Powell kind of has his mandate finishing next year, so he probably is more likely that you're going to wait out and appoint a new chairman next year. I think unless there is a big clash, I'm not sure there will be a big clash.
Yeah, but
push this year.
Right. But there I think you have to incorporate that. I think the lesson Trump learned or from his last term, and one that he's determined not to make again, is you know, there he surrounded himself with people that he considered that like out of, you know, central casting. They had to satisfy one of two criteria. Either they had to be billionaires or they had to be generals. Those were the kind of people he put most respect in. Now I think he has drawn the lesson that the you know, if the people around you are not believing in your agenda, then they may do like that executive on Goldman Sachs when he was going to put tariffs on Korea, or that he kept just taking it off his desk where he was going to sign and throwing it in the trash and hoping he would forget it, which he did. You know, that's, I think, came in maybe one of Woodward's books. But I think they know that now. So the chairman he's going to appoint would be my guess. I mean, and it's just a guess, is somebody that is going to be very pliable to his will. On the other hand, there is one aspect of this that is going to keep him in check, is that I suspect he is very responsive to short-term market behavior. So
stock market,
yeah. So if he puts in somebody, or if he starts floating names that are just wildly incompetent, I think you'll start seeing reaction, and he will react to that.
Yeah, and in a sense, you saw a little bit of that in the nomination of the Secretary Treasury, Scott Bessent, which in a sense was a little bit more mainstream as far as it can be compared to some of the other candidates who were kind of floated at the time, and it had a good reaction from the market. I think for the Fed chairman, one of the names that have been kind of floated around is Kevin Walsh, so which probably might be more on the mainstream compared to some of the other candidates.
Yeah, I think I don't think he would necessarily be one that would be but I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to predict. I mean, you know, what kind of agreement they would reach, or it's very hard I mean, I worked at the federal level. It's very hard to predict what kind of policymaker is, even if you know them personally for some time before. I mean, these things are very
and then what's your kind of generic, leaving aside the obviously the big discussion?
I just wanted to make one point about, I think you put your finger on something, and I don't want, so I in fact don't want to push it too hard. which is what is going to be the inflationary effect on tariffs? I mean, so I haven't studied that question in detail, but my inclination would be that they would be inflationary. But the truth is that we don't really have that much, at least recent data about it, because we've been seeing the world moving towards, more and more free trade over time. So I think it is a bit of a unknown. So, the view that it's not going to have much effect, and that might be true. My inclination is that it's going to have an effect, but I think the honest answer, if you ask me at least, is that I haven't seen yet compelling studies one way or another. I'm sure we're going to see them soon, and maybe I haven't just found and come across them that, tells us. And part of the issue is that we don't have, I mean, this is unprecedented that you get somebody in office. It's basically turning back the clock to Great Depression,
Yeah,
so
that's true. That's true.
It is a quite a disturbing prospect, and it's also just disturbing how he talks about trade deficits. He talks about it as if from the point of view of our company, like if it's profits or, I mean, Adam Smith, this is like mercantilism.
Yeah.
Adam Smith wrote his whole book in 76 or something, that is just directly aimed at debunking this. And here we are, like, centuries later, and we have a major presidential candidate peddling mercantilism that I thought was something we had resolved as a profession and society long time ago. The gains from trade, even though the thing that I don't want to, though, I think we did oversell it a little bit as economists. We showed that free trade would, increase social welfare, and then there were these effect on income inequality, but you could always compensate for the from the winners. But I mean, we never did that, did we? It just seemed to have accumulated at a very concentrated part of the distribution, while the lower end didn't gain. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why Trump has had such a...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right in a sense that it's been obviously unprecedented. I was more reflecting on kind of a conversation I had on a show about a couple of months ago with John Cochran from Stanford, that he was talking about exactly the point about are tariffs going to be inflationary? And his point was, well, it depends a lot of what the tariffs are, who they impose to, what sector is coverage. And therefore, if you were to say, I put a proper wall, which is every single sector, every single product from every single country, yes, that's an impact. But otherwise, kind of, that is, as you said, is a little bit unknown and untested. The other point probably I want to make is just trying to get a little bit from you, kind of looking forward now. We started already talking about what might happen. What you thought for 2025 in terms, obviously we've seen rates increasing quite a lot. And we talk a little bit about we talk a lot about monetary policy, but on fiscal policy, anything that kind of is any kind of changes happening? Do you think that the kind of fiscal policy, we're going to see deficit increasing, therefore are we going to see more focus on debt, or are we still kind of in a very kind of expansionary or kind of very loose fiscal policy, no end in sight and permanent deficit, but the market can absorb it? Or are we seeing actually rates going close to 5% now? Actually, the market started worrying about the level of debt.
Well, I don't think we're going to see anything like we saw before, where we had these direct checks in people's pockets that found themselves directly being fueling the economy. So I don't think we're going to see anything like that. We're probably going to see tax cuts on, corporations and billionaires. Sort of, I don't think we should and that may increase some to the deficit. I am not, I guess, as taken by the idea as Cochrane is, and he has been preaching this now for 10, 20 years. that the level of prices and thereby inflation is somehow determined by our expectation of some path of these models are what do you call primary surpluses, or the deficits, and that's gonna have some major impact on inflation. I think one way the way I think about it really is, the question is, to what extent does the excessive accumulation of debt affect what the Fed does? Okay, during war times, it is the case that the central governments often impose on their central bank, and we did that during World War II. You have to buy long-term debt at a certain rate. And then, it's clear that you are constraining monetary policy to be very accommodative to the financing needs of the government. If you don't have that, I am not seeing that just in itself, debt is going to, at least unless it really explodes, because then, then to the extent that, the cost of outright default is lower. We have seen throughout history, countries that print their own currency, they prefer not to default. They prefer to, instead depreciate the value with inflation. Now, the interesting question about interest rates, and this was just a few days ago when actually Krugman was talking about this in his blog, which is interesting, is that we're used to seeing as the Fed tightens, long rates going down, and we're seeing something else now, that the long rates, even if the Fed has been tightening, that the long rates have not been declining to the same extent.
Yeah.
And that poses a conundrum, and it is consistent, I guess, with the idea that the bond market is assessing Trump's term as being very inflationary. And, for all the reasons we mentioned, I would not necessarily put the deficits at the top of my list, to be honest. Unless, the Trump is appointing somebody or putting heavy pressures on the Federal Reserve because he wants to maintain low cost of, rolling over that debt. He doesn't want too big part of the budget to go into interest rate payments, which is how this expresses itself. Yeah. Like during World War II, that the Treasury Secretary didn't want to pay too much interest cost of their outstanding debt, and you want to be able to increase it further. So you put the pressure on the Fed, which is the fiscal agent of the government, to keep rates low, so the kid could keep financing themselves at low rates. Yeah. So something like that I could imagine, especially because I think Trump has made very unconventional, let's say, views on issues.
Yeah, and not always consistent with each other.
No, I think it's maybe it's the last person you spoke to, maybe it is. Although, I mean, again, the bright line is that we do have markets that will, and I think he is responsive to that.
Yeah. So some checks are there. Any from your work you did recently on the slanted L kind of Phillips curve, or what any lessons for policymaker? What should they be looking for? What should they be doing in the future in similar situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the most obvious one was that, when I was there, so I mean, I wrote my only op-ed of my career in October, I think, or September 2001. It was very unfortunate op-ed. I think this will mark the end of my career as an op-ed columnist. The only good thing I can say about it, it was only published in Japanese. I don't write Japanese, but they translated it, so nobody understood what I was. So it didn't, let's say, penetrate much. But there, I was essentially saying that declaring victory for Team Temporary, because there was this short period of time where it looked like inflation was coming down.
Yeah.
And it was literally like 2 weeks, and I managed to write that article exactly at the wrong time. So I think anybody like markets or the Fed, when they're going to be making forecasts in the future, I think they're going to recognize that capacity constraint.
Yeah.
And they're going to be more cognizant of the fact that, I mean, one aspect of why market was tight despite unemployment being relatively high was that the recovery from COVID was somewhat uneven.
Yeah.
So, you had people maybe having to move from one sector to another, which means that, the unemployment rate, people stayed unemployed perhaps a little longer than usual because, if you're moving from one sector to another, it's going to take you a little bit longer time to find a good fit. And that's going to then be expressed in the, demand from firms relative to the supply of workers. And I think now we know that that's an alternative measures like that are important as opposed to looking at unemployment alone. I think everybody agrees on that. And I hope people also start appreciating the fact that, the flatness of the little response of inflation to economic activity or variance in employment was the fact that people are estimating it to be very small was a mirage created by the fact that we had never really pushed up against these boundary of capacity constraints. So the Fed is going to take that into account, I think, next time.
That's good. And maybe they'll build it into the model.
So then they're gonna, well, it is also important to recognize that what the Fed did there was quite special in sort of historical context. They had rewritten their strategy, put asymmetric weight on unemployment, saying that they were not going to react even if they were going to go above maximum employment. And there's just, I don't want to be singling out anyone special, but they basically moved away from what had been a principle ever since Volcker, which was that the Fed always tried to preempt inflation picking up. And the Fed basically said, we're not going to do that any longer. And the reason for that is that they started regarding the increase in rates in 2015 as having been a mistake. What's the reason for that? Well, they started raising rates in 2015 because they estimated that maximum employment, the unemployment consistent with maximum consistent with maximum employment that would not trigger inflation was 4.9. So they were predicting that unemployment would go below 4.9 in the next month. So they started increasing rate and did it in a few steps. Well, unemployment went below 4.9, nothing happened to inflation, and trickled down even further. During that period, in 2015, 2019. And people probably don't remember, but this is in the midst of a boom, but inflation is still so low, very low. So they actually start cutting rates right at the eve of COVID, to an extent that the labor market was actually, you were asking about, the threshold was it crossed before. There is a brief period before where the threshold is crossed for the first time since the late 1960s. It didn't show up in inflation during that short period. And in our estimation, we find that was just due to sheer luck because they were offsetting forces on the supply side, positive supply shocks, which now we're having outside the fact because the threshold that sort of masked that development. So that's sort of so I think going forward, I think the Fed is going to be more tuned to preempting price and inflation, more attuned to that there is, in a sense, just as a logical matter, it's kind of silly to believe that you can, there is a finite number of people you can hire.
Yeah.
At some point, you run out of leg room. I mean, the old Keynesians that didn't even know about the Phillips curve, which we used to describe relationship between, tightness and inflation. They had it intuitively right. Okay, prices are not moving much, but surely once you've hired everybody and the factories are at full swing, I mean, and you increase demand, well, you can't produce anymore, so it has to just show up in prices.
Yeah.
And it's kind of weird that we forgot that.
Yeah. Sometimes you need a kind of some bit of a shock actually to relearn kind of
Well, I
history.
think it's just people were really just looking at the last war against inflation in the 70s. And there, I think the conventional wisdom, which I think is right, is that it had so much to do with inflation going all over the place.
Yeah.
It's inflation expectation, I'm sorry, going all over the place. And it wasn't now. I mean, that was kept them so calm and happy, and myself as well. Yeah. Look, inflation expectation are not moving, so, we're not going to have the 70s. No, you're going to have, the late 60s or the 50s Korea War. That's what's going to happen. You're going to have the other one of the other 6 inflation surges that unfortunately happened before the 70s that you choose to focus on.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I mean, one last question, obviously, and I appreciate it might be a bit of a kind of a tricky one, but you come from Iceland. There's been a lot of debate about Greenland. Do you think the US is going to buy Greenland?
I guess I'm not a big of a Twitter person, or X as it is called now, but I did raise the question there if I should feel like personally offended as an Icelander that it seems like Trump is only showing interest in buying Greenland, but what about Iceland? Iceland, it's huge, right? And we have beautiful mountains and volcanoes, and and I felt should I feel offended? No, but more seriously, it is Trump has really mastered the art of and nobody else, I think, before or will ever again, is mastered the art of saying things, and you're not quite sure if he's serious, trolling you, joking, or just to draw the attention away from something else, maybe. So I just don't. I mean, he can't be serious. I mean, Denmark is not going to sell Greenland, and is he going to invade the territory of another NATO country? I mean, he has shown some hesitancies about or lack of commitment to NATO, but the notion that he would invade a NATO country seems to me just so far-fetched.
No, I don't think even that kind of really is. It is.
I mean, he has said that. He has. I mean, but he has said that.
Yeah.
He said that he's willing to use military power. But I just don't know if that's just some sort of a weird joke or not. So yeah, but yeah, I don't know why he. But I mean, the thing is also from a point of view of defense. I mean, the U.S. has a military base on Iceland.
Yeah.
Which they shrunk. That was huge during the Cold War.
The Cold War, yeah.
Maybe 10,000 people. Then it shrunk very much during around 2000. But they also, I believe, have some military presence in Greenland. And I think they could do whatever they wanted in terms of. I think the Danes would not object to a big base. So maybe he's seeing some minerals there that he's excited about. I don't know.
Potentially. But maybe we'll see your post on X, and suddenly we'll have an interest in Iceland as well.
Oh no! I was mostly talking about how beautiful our sheep were. The best sheep, the smartest sheep, the in the history of sheep.
The best sheep, indeed. Well, Gauti, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. It's been a great conversation, and good luck all in your future work, and maybe kind of we'll see in a few. We will talk again in a few months' time to see actually how the inflation and the tariffs and all that have developed.
In which way we were wrong, because we're going to be wrong about.
We're going to be wrong in some way. But thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Our guest today was Gauti Eggertsson.
Thanks.